In 2020, a single case reached the Vatican, a case so unexplainable that Pope Francis himself personally approved it as an official miracle. It wasn't about a vision or an apparition. There were no flashing lights or heavenly voices witnessed by crowds. It began quietly with a little girl, a child whose story spread from a small French town all the way to Rome, forcing even the church's most cautious investigators to admit something beyond science had happened. For years, her family had kept silent, unsure how to explain what they had lived through. Doctors called it impossible. The church called it miraculous. This is the story of the miracle that began in a quiet hospital room and ended at the very heart of the Vatican. It began in a quiet corner of France in the city of Lyon, where narrow streets weave between rows of old stone houses, and the sound of church bells still echoes across the rooftops. It was late May of 2012. The days were long, the air warm, and families were gathering across the city to celebrate the arrival of summer. Inside a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, Emmanuel and Mayline Tran were hosting a small party. Their daughters, Lou-Anne and little 3-year-old Mayline, darted in and out of the living room as guests arrived, laughing and playing beneath strings of yellow lights. It was one of those simple, ordinary nights that seemed too peaceful to ever hold tragedy. Mayline, with her soft, dark hair and curious eyes, was the kind of child whose presence filled a room. She had a way of making everyone smile without trying, the kind of joy that radiates only from children who haven't yet learned to fear. That evening, she ran between her parents and relatives, giggling as she snatched snacks from the table and danced to the faint music playing in the background. Then, in a moment so small it almost escaped notice, everything changed. A piece of food, a tiny sausage, no bigger than a coin, slipped into her throat. No one saw it happen, not at first. But then came the coughing, sharp, frantic, desperate. Emmanuel rushed forward, scooping his daughter into his arms. The laughter stopped. Guests froze. Within seconds, the joyful hum of the evening turned into chaos. Mayline gasped, clawed at her throat, and then went still. Her lips turned pale, her skin cold. Clearing her airway, but nothing worked. He could feel her body growing heavy in his arms. Natalie grabbed the phone, trembling. "Emergency. Please, my daughter, she's not breathing." But their building was old, its hallways narrow. Ambulances couldn't reach their door, so Emmanuel ran. Down the stairs, through the courtyard, into the street, carrying his daughter like a soldier running from the battlefield. Each second felt longer than life itself. When the paramedics finally arrived, Emmanuel's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't let go of her. The medics took over, pressing, breathing, injecting. Then a faint pulse. A fragile heartbeat flickered back to life. There was a glimmer of hope. They rushed her to the nearest hospital. Emmanuel and Natalie followed in silence, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles turned white. In the ambulance, machines beeped, lights flashed, and little Mayline's body trembled beneath the oxygen mask. But when they arrived, hope began to fade again. Doctors flooded the room. They stabilized her, but she went into cardiac arrest again and again, 3 times that night. By dawn, the verdict was devastating. The oxygen loss had lasted too long. Her brain had suffered catastrophic damage. When the doctors showed the scans, Emmanuel couldn't speak. The image was unmistakable. Her brain tissue had shrunk, starved of air. "She will not wake up," one of the doctors said softly. "Even if her heart keeps beating, she will not return to who she was." For hours, Natalie sat beside her daughter's bed, staring at the small hand she once held on morning walks. She whispered prayers she hadn't said in years. Emmanuel stood near the window, silent, motionless, looking out at the city below. In another room, a nurse adjusted the monitor, unaware that she was witnessing the beginning of something that would one day reach the Vatican. Outside, Lyon awoke to a normal day: trams running, markets opening, sunlight spilling across the river. But inside the hospital, time had stopped. The world was reduced to the rhythmic pulse of machines and the shallow sound of a little girl's breathing. The following hours turned into days. Doctors tried everything: oxygen therapy, medication, monitoring. Nothing changed. Mayline's eyes remained open, but empty, glassy, unblinking. There was no movement, no sign of awareness. One physician gently suggested to the family that perhaps it was time to stop. "We can keep her heart beating," he said quietly, "but her mind is gone." Emmanuel shook his head. "No, not yet." That night, the hospital room fell into silence again, except for the beeping monitors and the occasional sigh of the machines keeping her alive. Natalie sat in the corner, clutching a small rosary she had found in her drawer at home, even though she hadn't prayed it in years. She whispered, "Please, Lord, don't let this be the end." Outside, the lights of Lyon shimmered faintly through the hospital window. The same city that had laughed and danced hours earlier now held its breath with them. And somewhere between those walls, between life and death, a story began that would one day cross oceans, pass through Vatican gates, and stand before Pope Francis himself. The night Mayline Tran slipped into her coma was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. In the days that followed, the Tran family lived in a fog of machines, whispered updates, and sleepless nights. The smell of disinfectant filled every hallway. The world outside might as well have stopped existing. Emmanuel kept count of the hours since the accident. He'd mark them quietly in his phone, not as a way to measure time, but as a way to keep himself from falling apart. Natalie sat at Mayline's bedside from dawn until the nurses forced her to rest. The hospital staff spoke in soft, practiced tones, the kind used for parents who have already lost something they cannot admit losing. Every morning began the same way. The sound of footsteps, the click of the door, the faint hum of medical monitors. Doctors came and went, offering words that pretended to be hopeful but carried no light. "Her condition remains stable," they would say. Stable, the cruelest word of all. It meant nothing was changing. It meant the brain was still silent. At night, Emmanuel would lean against the window, watching the streetlights blur through the rain. "I keep asking God why," he said one evening, his voice cracking. "If he can hear us, why doesn't he do something?" Natalie didn't answer. She simply placed a hand over his and whispered, "Then let's ask louder." The next morning, help arrived in a form they didn't expect. A woman from Mayline's Catholic school, a quiet mother with kind eyes, visited the hospital carrying a small booklet. On the cover was an unfamiliar name, Pauline Jaricot. "I know you're suffering," she said softly, "but there is someone you should know about. She lived here in Lyon, not far from this very place. She believed in the power of united prayer. Try praying through her intercession. Make a novena." Emmanuel hesitated. He hadn't prayed in years. Natalie, though, took the booklet gently, as if afraid it might vanish. Inside were 9 short prayers, one for each day. The woman explained, "When many people pray together, even in different homes, they become one voice before God." That was Pauline's dream. That evening, when the machines buzzed and the halls fell silent, Natalie read the first prayer aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but as the words filled the room, something changed, not in the machines, but in her heart. Emmanuel stood beside her, listening, uncertain, then joined in by whispering the last line, "We trust in you." Word began to spread among the parents at the school. One family became 10, then 20. People who had never met the Trans knelt together in their homes, lighting candles, whispering the same words each night. Photos of Mayline circulated between phones and inboxes. In classrooms and living rooms, her name became part of daily prayer. For the first time since the accident, Natalie slept. The novena continued day after day, voice after voice, faith after faith. Even the hospital chaplain, an elderly priest with tired eyes, joined in. "We have seen things science could not explain," he said quietly. "Perhaps this will be one of them." Still, the doctors were unmoved. Her EEG showed no brain activity. Her eyes remained glassy. By the 7th day, Emmanuel felt torn between reason and hope. "What if we're praying for nothing?" he asked. Natalie looked at him, exhausted but certain. "Then we're still praying, because love doesn't stop when logic does." On the 8th day, a small mass was offered at the school. Parents gathered, children held rosaries too large for their hands. The priest lifted his voice above the silence. "We ask not for a sign, but for the courage to believe." Back in the hospital, Mayline lay motionless. Machines blinked. The air smelled of antiseptic and faint roses from the flowers someone had left by her bed. Natalie knelt again. Her knees ached, her lips dry, but she whispered, "Pauline, if you can hear me, help us." That night, Emmanuel dreamed. It wasn't like ordinary dreams, not the kind that fade when you wake. It was clear, almost solid. He stood beside his daughter's bed, and a light filled the room. It wasn't bright. It was soft, golden, the color of morning sunlight. Then a voice calm, perfect, beyond description spoke from within that light. "Put your hands on her head. Do not be afraid. Everything will be fine." He looked down, his hands were burning, glowing from within. And in that warmth, he felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. He woke suddenly, heart racing, sweat on his forehead. It was still dark outside. For the first time in weeks, he felt calm. At sunrise, he returned to the hospital, unsure of what to believe. When he stepped into the room, he froze. Natalie was already there, leaning forward, her face in her hands. "Look," she whispered. Mayline's eyes were open, not empty, but alive. Her gaze followed the light through the window. Her pupils contracted. Her fingers twitched. Emmanuel dropped to his knees. "Mayline?" No answer. Only a faint breath, but it was her breath. He turned to the doctor entering the room. "What did you do?" The doctor shook his head. "Nothing. Nothing at all." The novena had ended, and the silence of the machines was no longer silence. It was the beginning of a heartbeat that would soon echo across the world. For days, no one dared to use the word miracle. Not yet. Not even in whispers. Mayline's awakening seemed, at first, like a fragile accident, a random flicker of something that science couldn't yet name. When Emmanuel told the doctors about his dream, they smiled politely. "Dreams are how the mind copes," one of them said gently. "They help us hold on." But this dream was not comfort. It was prophecy. On July 2nd, 2012, the morning after Emmanuel's vision, something changed that every machine, every test, every chart failed to predict. The nurses noticed it first. The little girl whose gaze had been empty for weeks was now following movements in the room. Her eyes tracked the nurse's hand, then the light coming through the blinds. The stillness that had once defined her began to tremble, first her eyelids, then her fingers. Natalie leaned forward, afraid to breathe. She whispered her name, Mayline. A tiny movement, a blink, a sound that could have been a sigh or the softest mama ever spoken. She called for Emmanuel. He ran from the hallway, almost tripping over the chair beside the bed. His heart pounded like a drum. He saw it instantly. Her eyes, once glassy and lifeless, were alive again. There was depth in them, recognition. Something ancient in every parent's soul knows the moment when their child looks back, truly looks back. "She's here," he said, his voice trembling. "She's here." The doctors came running. They performed the same exams, asked the same questions. Nothing in the data made sense. Her brain scans, taken days before, had shown catastrophic damage, oxygen deprivation, severe enough to cause total cortical death. And yet, her responses, eye movement, reflex, awareness defied those same results. One of the physicians stared at the monitor, then at the girl, then at Emmanuel. This shouldn't be possible. The days that followed were a slow unraveling of every prediction ever made about her condition. Mayline began to move her hands, then her legs. Her breathing steadied. By the end of the week, she sat upright for the first time since the accident. Natalie cried so hard she could barely stay on her feet. "It's her," she whispered. "It's really her." Word spread quietly through the hospital corridors. Nurses passed it to one another like a secret they couldn't keep. The girl in room 12, the one declared beyond recovery, was smiling. The family from the Catholic school heard next. The same parents who had prayed the novena gathered again, this time to give thanks. At the small chapel near the school, candles flickered in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary. The priest raised his hands and said simply, "What God begins in silence, he completes in glory." Back at the hospital, Mayline's recovery accelerated in ways that left even the most skeptical physicians speechless. Scans taken again showed brain activity returning where there should have been none. Reflexes reappeared. Memory began to surface. When she recognized her sister, Lou-Anne, the room filled with quiet laughter and tears. Emmanuel couldn't stop thinking about the voice in his dream. It hadn't promised a miracle. It had spoken peace into a place that had none. He began writing everything down in a small notebook. The time of the dream, the words, the sequence of events, the medical updates. He wanted to remember every detail, not to prove it, but to preserve it. Weeks later, Mayline left the hospital. She walked slowly, carefully, but she walked through the same doors where her parents had once entered, believing they would never see her alive again. Doctors called it spontaneous neural reactivation, a phrase that sounded clinical enough to fill the space where science ran out. But the family knew it was something more. Months passed. The Tran family tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Every moment felt like borrowed time. They told no one outside their circle what had happened. They feared being misunderstood or worse, being told that what they had seen was nothing. Yet one question kept echoing in Emmanuel's mind. What now? If something this impossible had happened through prayer, shouldn't it be shared? It was the priest from their parish who finally helped them understand. If this was truly through the intercession of Pauline Jaricot, he said, then you must tell the church, not for fame, not for you, but for the truth. And so they did. In the autumn of 2012, the Diocese of Lyon opened a formal investigation. Doctors were summoned. Witnesses gave sworn statements. Medical records were compared, cross-examined, and archived. Every explanation, infection, treatment error, delayed reaction was ruled out. A commission of theologians was appointed to examine not only the recovery, but the way it happened through prayer, through intercession, through unity. And the more they studied, the more the impossible became undeniable. By the end of the inquiry, one phrase began appearing in the reports again and again: healing without scientific explanation. But inside the Tran household, No one called it that. They called it by a different name. They called it grace. When Mayline came home, the neighborhood gathered at their windows. No one said the word miracle, but everyone felt it. She walked slowly between her parents, one hand in each of theirs, sunlight spilling across the cobblestones. The little girl who had left in an ambulance now returned on her own 2 feet. Inside, everything looked the same: the toys, the drawings on the fridge, but nothing felt the same. Every sound seemed softer, every breath sacred. Emmanuel carried her backpack to the table, as if it were made of glass. Natalie kissed her hair again and again, unable to stop. The doctors kept calling, asking for updates, arranging follow-up scans. Each test only deepened the mystery. Her brain had healed far beyond medical explanation. No scarring, no deficits, no trace of the catastrophe that should have ended her life. When the neurologist met them in person, he simply shook his head. "I've practiced for 30 years, he said. "I've never seen this." For the Tran family, gratitude became a language of its own. Every morning, they began the day with silence and a single sentence: "Thank you." Mayline would join her palms and whisper, "Merci, Jesus." But as the weeks passed, something in Emmanuel stirred. Gratitude wasn't enough. He felt called to tell what had happened, not to glorify himself, but to bear witness. "If God did this," he said, "then the world should know." Their parish priest encouraged them to write everything down: the medical records, the timeline, the novena, the dream. "If the Lord's hand is truly here," he said, "the church will recognize it." So they did. They compiled hospital reports, printouts, witness testimonies, even the names of everyone who had prayed during the novena. It filled a thick folder bound with string, the same file that would one day travel across borders and land on a Vatican desk. Meanwhile, word of Mayline's recovery spread quietly through Lyon. Journalists called, then backed away when they heard the family didn't want publicity. Parish after parish began mentioning her in homilies. In coffee shops and marketplaces, strangers lowered their voices to tell one another, "A child who was gone has come back." Yet within the Tran home, humility ruled. Natalie kept repeating, "We are not special. We are just grateful." In 2013, the Archdiocese of Lyon officially opened an inquiry. A panel of physicians reviewed every test. Theologians examined the chain of prayer. They interviewed Emmanuel and Natalie under oath. The process was exacting: weeks of questions, long pauses, careful phrasing. "Do you believe your daughter's healing was supernatural?" Emmanuel answered simply, "I believe it was love." Each expert wrote their conclusion. None could supply a scientific reason. One neurologist ended his report with a single line: "Unexplained by medicine, consistent with divine intervention." The file grew thicker: signed pages, sealed envelopes, translated documents. It was no longer just a family's testimony. It had become a case. By 2018, after years of scrutiny, the local tribunal declared the investigation complete. The dossier, now stamped and bound, was ready for Rome. That winter morning, a courier stepped into the courtyard of the Archdiocese carrying a weathered briefcase. Inside lay every heartbeat, every tear, every line of Emmanuel's dream recorded in ink. He placed it on the seat beside him as his train pulled away from Lyon. Through the window, the city faded: the birthplace of both Pauline Jaricot and the child whose life she had touched. The journey took him south through the Alps, past dawn-lit valleys, then west toward Italy. Snow dusted the peaks like ash over marble. By the time the train crossed into Rome, evening light had turned the city gold. He delivered the case to the gates of the Vatican, where guards examined the seal embossed with the cross of Lyon. Within hours, the envelope lay on a mahogany table beneath the dim glow of a desk lamp. Stamped across its front, Case Miracle Investigation Lyon, France. In that silent room, the world seemed to hold its breath. The Vatican process would take years, more scientific panels, theological commissions, prayer, and waiting. But in that moment, everything was already set in motion. The story that began in a quiet French apartment had crossed into eternity's ledger. And somewhere in Lyon, as night fell, a little girl knelt by her bed. "Thank you," she whispered again. Long before anyone had heard the name Mayline Tran, another young woman had walked the same streets of Lyon, carrying her own impossible dream. Her name was Pauline Jaricot. She had been born more than 2 centuries earlier, in 1799, into a wealthy silk merchant family when France was still reeling from the Revolution. Churches had been stripped bare, priests driven into hiding, and the very idea of faith mocked in salons and cafes. Yet in that wasteland of belief, Pauline grew up with a restlessness. She could not explain a fire that would one day ignite millions of prayers around the world. As a child, she was bright, proud, fascinated by fine dresses and the music of parties. By 15, she was known for her beauty, her wit, and her taste for elegance. She believed in God, but from a comfortable distance, until the day everything changed. One Sunday, she slipped into Mass, more out of habit than devotion, and heard a priest preach on vanity. His words struck her like a stone thrown through glass. "What is beauty," he asked, "if it hides a soul that has forgotten heaven?" Pauline left the church in tears. That afternoon, she tore the ribbons from her dress and locked herself in her room. Within days, she had vowed chastity and dedicated her life to God, but she would not enter a convent. Her calling was stranger, larger, to make holiness live among ordinary people. At first, her family thought it a phase. Then they watched as she began visiting the silk workers in the Croix-Rousse district, women bent over looms, hands bleeding, children sleeping under tables while their mothers worked. Pauline dressed like them, spoke like them, listened to their stories. She brought food, medicine, and prayer. But compassion alone was not enough for her. She saw that charity without structure fades, and faith without action dies. So she began to organize. In 1822, she gathered a few friends and founded the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. Each member promised to donate a small coin, each week the price of a coffee for the missions. It was a humble idea, yet within 10 years it spanned continents, funding churches and schools from Asia to the Americas. 4 years later, she created something even more audacious: the Living Rosary. She divided the 15 mysteries of the Rosary among 15 people, each praying 1 decade daily. Together they completed a full rosary every day, a living chain of intercession stretching across the world. 15 coals, she wrote, 1 burning, 3 half lit, the rest cold, bring them close, and they will blaze. Through her, prayer became network, devotion became movement, and unity became power. She lived simply, often giving away everything she owned. When she spoke, people listened not because she was rich or clever, but because she glowed with conviction. Workers, priests, and nobles called her La Sainte de Lyon, the Saint of Lyon, long before Rome ever would. Yet her life ended in silence. After a series of failed investments made in trust and naivety, she lost her fortune, her health, and her public esteem. The same society she had served turned away from her. She died in 1862, poor and largely forgotten, whispering, "My heart is at peace because I have loved." For more than a century, her name faded into archives and old prayer cards. But the fire she had kindled never went out. The Living Rosary continued in small groups scattered across Europe, then re-emerged in the age of the Internet, the same spiritual network reborn in digital form. So when a mother in Lyon in 2012 heard Pauline's name and began a novena for a dying child, it was as though time itself folded. 2 centuries collapsed into a single prayer. A saint in waiting from the industrial age reached across the years to touch a modern hospital room filled with beeping machines. When Vatican officials later opened the dossier, they noticed this echo. Both women were from Lyon. Both women believed that prayer unites what the world divides. In the margins of one report, a theologian scribbled, Pauline Jaricot once said, "God acts through those who allow him to act." Perhaps he has acted again. Her beatification process had been waiting for a miracle, a single documented sign that heaven had confirmed her life's work. And now, it seemed, it had come through a 3-year-old girl who should have died. The investigators studying the Tran case soon realized they were not only examining a healing, they were witnessing the continuation of a mission. The chain Pauline had forged in 1826-15 coals burning together was still alive, glowing in the hearts of parents, teachers, and strangers who had prayed as one. In that realization, the miracle grew even larger. It was not only the resurrection of a child's health, but the resurrection of a forgotten saint's voice. By the time the file reached Rome, one sentence summarized it all. Through the intercession of the servant of God Pauline Jaricot, a child declared beyond recovery returned to life and health. The world had almost forgotten her, but heaven had not. In Rome, miracles do not rush. They move through marble corridors and candlelit offices, each step weighed with patience, humility, and proof. The dossier from Lyon arrived in 2018, carried through the bronze doors of the dicastery for the causes of saints. Inside were hundreds of pages, sworn testimonies, medical scans, hospital timelines, novena documents, and the statement of a father who had once dreamed of a voice. On its front cover, embossed in red, Case Miracle Investigation, Lyon, France. It landed on a wooden desk beneath a crucifix older than the French Republic. The clerk who opened it that morning had handled dozens of cases, healings, apparitions, conversions, but this one felt different. Its subject was a child, and its echoes reached all the way back to Pauline Jaricot, the woman whose devotion had built the church's missionary heartbeat. The process began in silence. First came the medical commission, composed of independent physicians, some believers, others not. Their task was simple in theory, brutal in practice: determine whether Mayline Tran's healing could be explained by science. For months they examined the evidence. They pored over the brain scans showing irreversible damage, the blood reports, the notes from neurologists who had written no hope. They replayed the timeline: oxygen loss, cardiac arrests, total shutdown, then spontaneous, full recovery. One of the doctors, a veteran neurosurgeon from Milan, wrote in the margin of his report, "If this were merely rare, I would call it rare. If it were coincidence, I would call it coincidence. But this is neither." When the board convened for its final session, 10 physicians voted. All 10 agreed. There was no medical explanation for what had occurred. The file advanced to the next phase, the theological commission. Now the question shifted from how to why. Was this healing truly linked to the intercession of Pauline Jaricot, or merely a family's private prayer answered in mystery? The theologians studied the novena. 9 days of prayer, the communal effort of parents, children, and teachers. They analyzed the timing Mayline's sudden awakening on the day the novena ended. They noted the father's dream, the unity of intention, the total absence of superstition or spectacle. Their conclusion mirrored Pauline's own writings from 2 centuries earlier. When hearts unite in prayer, grace multiplies. With both approvals, the case moved to the Cardinal Commission, where senior church officials reviewed every line. Their meetings took place behind closed doors in the Apostolic Palace, the air thick with dust and reverence. On the long oak table lay the dossier, now marked with a small crimson ribbon. At the head of the table sat Cardinal Angelo Beccia, then prefect of the dicastery. He read aloud the summary statement prepared by the postulator. A child in Lyon, declared clinically beyond recovery, was restored to life and health through prayers offered to the servant of God, Pauline Jaricot. The room fell silent. Outside, bells from St. Peter's echoed through the evening air. The vote was unanimous. The file was sent to the Pope. May 26, 2020. It was early morning in the Domus Sancti Marthi, the guest house where Pope Francis resides. The world outside was still reeling from the pandemic, Rome's streets empty, except for the chirping of birds along the Tiber. On his desk lay a single folder with a red ribbon. He read the summary twice, then closed his eyes. Those who were present said he remained silent for a long moment, fingers resting lightly on the page. Finally, he reached for his pen and signed the decree. The words were simple but eternal. We recognize the healing of Mayline Tran through the intercession of the Venerable Pauline Jaricot as a true miracle. With that signature, Pauline Jaricot became Blessed Pauline Jaricot. When the news reached Lyon, church bells rang across the city. The same bells that had tolled for her funeral in 1862 now celebrated her return to the living memory of the church. Emmanuel and Natalie wept as they watched the announcement on television. "I can't believe it," Natalie whispered. "They heard us. All of heaven heard us." The beatification was scheduled for May 22, 2022, exactly 2 years after the decree. The ceremony would take place in Lyon, the city that had once forgotten her and now welcomed her home. When the day came, thousands filled the basilica. Among them, in the front pew, sat a family of 4 Emmanuel, Natalie, Lou-Anne, and Mayline. As incense rose through the basilica, the lights of Lyon shimmered below, and the world seemed to whisper back, "It was."